Trust the Profits Breeders' Cup coverage is brought to you by PlayUp Racebook, the most horse player-friendly racebook in the industry. PlayUp Racebook is always your best bet.
Pre-entries are out for the Breeders' Cup, and we all have takes. Here are my 5 quick reactions to the pre-entries for the 2022 Breeders' Cup. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host for this episode on Trust the Profits. My name is Matthew Desantis. You can find me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace. Just a quick reminder to make sure to like and subscribe to Trust the Profits YouTube channel, and also to make sure to go over and check out PlayUp Racebook. Going on right now, you can receive a 50% deposit bonus for up to $250. And for the Breeders' Cup, you can deposit $100 or more before the races start on Friday and Saturday, and they will give you an additional $25 free wager. So make sure to go over to PlayUp Racebook for all of your best bets. Now, as for the Breeders' Cup, we have a lot going on here. Pre-entries were just released on Wednesday, and so I thought I would share with you my 5 quick reactions to my thoughts on the pre-entries, what we learned, what we may continue to learn over the following week, and maybe how to approach some of these races. So let's dive right in to my 5 quick reactions to the pre-entries for the 2022 Breeders' Cup. We'll start with the very first one, which is my first reaction was that this is a very Western affair. Last year, we had horses from all over the world. We had a lot of horses from Japan. Obviously, the victory of Loves Only You, Marche Lorraine, really put Japanese racing on the map for many American audiences that may not have been familiar with it. This year going through, only one Japanese trained horse is in the entire Breeders' Cup. Why is this? Well, there are a few reasons. One, distance. Last year, of course, was at Del Mar. This year's at Keeneland. That's an extra 3 hours on a flight, more of a time difference for these horses. There's still a quarantine process for horses coming in from overseas. So it just logistically is more difficult. The other thing is there's some really big races taking place over in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong, over the next month. That not only attracted a number of Japanese horses, I'll be honest, a number of European horses are actually headed over to Europe, or to Asia, I should say, and Hong Kong for some of those races. So not only did this detract from the Japanese flavor in the Breeders' Cup for this year, but some of those races over in Hong Kong also took away some of the top flight European horses that may have otherwise pointed to the Breeders' Cup. But this year is a much more Western affair. North American horses, European horses, and not much else. Like I said, only one Japanese trained horse in the entire field. So let's move on. What is my quick reaction? Number 2, well, the distaff is going to have a very different feel from 2021. You look over those pre-entry PPs and racing forms, whether you get them on Brisnet, whether you get them on Daily Racing Form, no matter who you like to go through to get those forms, Time Form US, doesn't matter. You look at the distaff this year, and it looks completely different than the distaff last year. And you go, Matthew, how's that possible? A lot of the same horses are running. It's true, but the pace scenario is completely different because Latruska is not running in the distaff. Latruska is running the filly and mare sprint in all likelihood. This changes the upfront pace dynamic and early speed that will be displayed in the distaff. When you look at the PPs, the only horse that wants the lead is Society. That's the horse that's going to want the lead. This is, of course, the gun runner from Steve Asmussen, who won the Cotillion, Grade 1 Cotillion last time out. She is going to want to go to the lead. Nobody else wants to go to the lead. Search Results wants to sit a very close second, but I don't think we're going to see Search Results go nuclear the way that she did against Latruska at the Ogden Phipps. Remember when those two were 15 lengths clear of everyone else? I don't think you're going to see that type of pace scenario. And so as a result, I think Society could potentially have a very different type of trip than what we saw the front runners have last year, where that pace was so hot, broke down so entirely, and you saw these huge long shots coming in from the back of the field. Certainly a lot of questions about how does this set up for a horse like Clairiere, Malathat, who like to be those deep closers who come running late. If Society's able to get an easy lead, the pace to scenario in the distaff is completely different from 2021. Everybody always is looking for prices. And my quick reaction number 3 is Friday, the juvenile Philly races, both on turf and on the dirt. That's where I'm going to be looking for my prices. There's a lot of horses that I really, really like underneath in both of those spots. And so I think Friday's, like I said, quite wide open. If you're looking into juvenile Phillies turf, certainly the horse Meditate, the Aidan O'Brien horse, is very, very impressive. But you look at a horse like G. Laurie, Graham Motion horse, who had all sorts of trouble last time out, and I think is very, very talented. This is a horse I really like a lot. A horse like Pleasant Passage, the Shug McGahee horse, who was, won last time out, but went off as one of the longer shots on the board that day, ended up winning that race. I like Shug McGahee horses a lot. I think Pleasant Passage is potentially a pretty special horse, but that's another one looking probably going to get some decent value there. Even the Kevin Attard course, Last Call, who won the Natalma up there at Woodbine last year. That's a horse that again went off at a huge price in that race, won at about 20-1, is probably still going to be a price, even though Last Call won that race. And remember, the Natalma, which both Last Call and G. Laurie come out of, remember, that's the race that produced Pizza Bianca last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile Phillies turf winner. So something to keep in mind. On the dirt, I also think the Juvenile Phillies is a wide open field. That just feels very, very, very even across the board. I know some people like Chocolate Gelato a lot. I understand that. I'm not as sold on Wagon Wheel. I think the race shape in this case is not going to work out as well for Wagon Wheel. But I think you can look at a horse like Chop Chop. I think you can look at a horse like Raging Sea. I think you can look at a horse like American Rocket, some people like, I know. You look at a horse certainly like Atomically, who I talked about on the Todd Pletcher Barn Tour. There's some real nice potential prices, I think, Friday in those juvenile Philly races, both on the dirt and on turf. I know everybody always says the Breeders' Cup can sometimes feel chalky, and it can at times. Last year felt chalky, and it all fell up to pieces. This year, there are some races that might feel a little chalky, but I think Friday, those juvenile Philly races, that's where I'm targeting in to get a little bit of value. Quick reaction number 4 from me is, In many ways, is Jackie Warrior the lone speed in a sprint race? It seems bizarre, but when you look over the PPs for the early entries into the the Breeders' Cup Sprint on Saturday, Jackie's Warrior is kind of the only speed in this race. Maybe Pipeline, who certainly pressed Jackie's Warrior last time out. That was at 7 furlongs. Remember with Jackie's Warrior eventually succumbing to Cody's Wish in that race. But otherwise, nobody else really wants to be on the lead, and nobody else has the speed to contest Jackie's Warrior on the lead. It does seem bizarrely that Jackie's Warrior is going to get a relatively uncontested lead in a sprint race, which is pretty surprising. Most of the rest of the field, and certainly most of the rest of the serious contenders, are stalkers, mid-pack, or deep closers. They're not front runners. So it's very interesting that you look at a Breeders' Cup sprint race, and there's a lot of speed, obviously, in that race, but there's not necessarily a lot of front end speed. Jackie's Warrior could absolutely be able to hold them off on the front end and carve out a very easy trip for himself and be able to ride into retirement a Breeders' Cup champion winner. It's very interesting to look at this pace dynamic, a little bit similar to the distaff, where last year we had one pace scenario. This year we seem to have a very different pace scenario, and it is quite telling that Jackie's Warrior really is the only horse, when you look at those PPs, that's got the ones all the way across the running line. Everybody else sitting 2, sitting 3, sitting 4, sitting 5, sitting 6. They're not all sitting 1. So Jackie's Warrior is the speed of the speed here. Does feel like this might be a nice race setup for the champion. And then finally, let's go to my final quick reaction, which is our only chance to beat the Euros on the turf is with a mare. And that is, of course, Warlike Goddess. But I think one of the things that really stuck out to me, particularly when looking at the races on Saturday, is just how dominant the Europeans look on these turf races. I know we get very enamored with Chad Brown horses, rightfully so. I know there's a lot of horses from a lot of trainers that we like here in North America. When the Europeans bring over their best stock, and to be clear, they're not even bringing over their best stock. They're bringing over, in some cases, their second and third tiered horses. When they bring them over, good night. I mean, I think a great example of this is in the Breeders' Cup Mile. When you look at a horse like Annapolis, who I think we're all very high on, won a grade 1 last time out, ran a 103 Beyer speed figure. That's very impressive until you look at the fact that Modern Games came over, dropped a 112 at Woodbine, and then promptly went back overseas. It's just, there's a gap. There is a gap. And Modern Games, I think, is a dominant figure there. But there's some other horses that are very, very good. I know some folks that I respect really like Moira potentially in that race. Shout out to Ed DeRosa from Horse Racing Nation. But there's some of them for everybody in that race. But it's hard to get past the Europeans. I think the same thing's true in the Breeders' Cup Turf. Just such a deep field. Whether you're looking at Mishriff, whether you're looking at Broom, horses like Nashua earlier in the card as well. There's just so many good horses on the turf coming over from Europe. And the reality is, I think the only horse that we can rely on to potentially challenge the Europeans is Warlike Goddess. Now, some people will say domestic spending. Okay, domestic spending, of course, making his return to the racetrack after a 16-month layoff. This is unprecedented to have a horse coming off this type of layoff and expect this horse to win. I think we've had horses coming off long layoffs before, but it's very, very rare. I believe DeHaas had at least one warm-up race, I think, previously before running. And so you had some horses that, like I said, just had these, preps. But the fact that domestic spending is our other best hope tells you where we are as a turf division going up against the Europeans, that we're relying on a horse coming off a 16-month layoff to be the best representation of American turf racing. Not necessarily an ideal spot to be in. Meanwhile, Warlike Goddess, so impressive. I root for her, obviously. I think she absolutely can hold her own with the boys in this particular race, but it is going to be hard to get past the Europeans. Now, that said, just because I said it's hard to get past the Europeans doesn't mean it's hard to get past the chalk. I think there's a lot of Euros entered in this. I think it could go a few different directions. So make sure to continue to tune into our coverage to get all of our picks and previews for all of the races for the Breeders' Cup. So those are my 5 quick reactions to the pre-entries that were drawn on Wednesday. Of course, make sure to stay tuned to Trust the Profits on our YouTube channel. Make sure to press that subscribe button. We're over 7,000 subscribers. 7,000 people can't be wrong, right? So we clearly have a lot of content for you. Come pushing out stuff daily, top 5 lists, deep dives into individual horses, deep dives into individual trainers. We still got capping the card stuff coming up. Outside of the Breeders' Cup, we always have other handicapping, betting programs for you. So we have something for everyone, no matter what aspect of the sport you are interested in. So like I said, make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace to make sure to stay up with all the latest content that I'm pushing out here, and subscribe and like Trust the Profits. And finally, make sure to check out our sponsor, PlayUp Racebook. You can go to their site, download their app for free, and receive a 50% deposit bonus for up to $250. And then prior to the Breeders' Cup, if you deposit $100 or more, they will give you an additional $25 free wager. Maybe use that on some of those Juvenile Philly races on Friday. But that's been my quick reaction. Like I said, make sure to stay tuned to Trust the Profits. We got so much more coming up next week. We got picks and previews. We got capping the card, where I'm going to give you value plays for every single race in the Breeders' Cup. We're going to talk about having guests on. We're going to have fantasy drafts of the Breeders' Cup. We're going to have so much great stuff next week. You don't want to miss it. Until next time, friends, my name is Matthew Desantis, and reminding you that it's now post time.